start. Feel free to greet one another in the chat. Let us know where you're from. I'm Cindy Shepard. I'm the Green Team Director for Faith in Place, and really excited about this monthly call. I was even more excited when I saw the registration sheet this afternoon and looked. I saw zip codes from the East Coast all the way out to the West Coast, up California through Oregon and Washington. And it's really great to have all of you here from wherever you are joining us from. I think the intense interest in this update from COP27 is indicative of the intense interest that people of faith across this country and around the world have in climate action, and the hope that we can make this a pivotal year. Welcome, welcome. I think we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, I'm the Green Team Director for Faith in Place, Cindy Shepard, and Faith in Place is a tri-state affiliate of Interfaith Power and Light. We're active in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, and I want to share our mission with everyone. Our mission at Faith in Place is to empower people of diverse faiths and spiritualities to be leaders in advancing environmental and racial justice, providing resources that educate, connect, and advocate for healthier communities. As we are an interfaith organization, we have some norms that we ask everyone to go by. The first is that, of course, respect for one another and one another's traditions. As we are together here, we listen to understand, not knowing that we don't always have clear answers. Third norm is to take space and make space. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. Please put your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. Ask for help from the Faith in Place folks in the chat. If you're having technical difficulties, we have people that can help you with that. And because we are a relatively large group tonight, if you come up with questions during the presentation or at any time in the evening, please use the chat to make a note of those questions. We'll be watching for them there, and you'll remember what they were when it comes time for questions and answers. So welcome. We're very, very glad that everyone is here. This is terrific. I want to turn the microphone over now to Jenny Judd, our Operations Director, who will give our land acknowledgement for this evening.
Thank you, Cindy. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenny Judd, Faith in Place's Operations and Finance Director, and I'm pleased to share with you a land acknowledgement honoring the ancestral heritage of the land on which I stand this evening. I'm calling from what is today known as Glen Ellen, Illinois. This land has a history we do not fully know nor comprehend. We wish to acknowledge and thank all the indigenous peoples and nations who inhabited this land for many thousands of years before us, for their care, respect, and attention given to this ground that we now stand on. In more recent history, before European peoples arrived, this was the land of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, who are also known as the Council of Three Fires. Others, such as the Sioux, Kickapoo, Peoria, Miami, Sauk, Fox, and Illinois, also settled on and moved through this land. The people of these tribes cared for this land as stewards of the rivers, the wildlife, and the plants which flourished. They inhabited villages in the area, including those in what are now known as Churchill Woods and the Morton Arboretum. Let us pause for a moment, and I invite you to drop in the chat where you are calling from and the ancestral heritage of that land. You can use the link Native Land to begin answering questions about whose land you reside on and how you are benefiting by living on this land that is the traditional territory of Indigenous people. We also have a page on our website linked in the chat with podcasts, books, videos, organizations, and more to help you learn about the history of the people indigenous to the land where we live. This acknowledgement from Faith in Place demonstrates a commitment to continue the process to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We acknowledge these Native nations are still present among us and that we as a team are learning about the true history of our land. Our aim is to become a vibrant, inclusive community with environmental justice at the core of our efforts. And now Reverend Veronica Johnson will give an invocation.
Good evening, all. Thank you for being here. I encourage you to take a deep breath. I know we've gathered from different moments in time. Some of us may have been rushing to get here. Others may have been sitting in the same chair all day. So just take a moment and take a deep breath and relax a bit and let us pray. In acknowledgement of all faith traditions that are present in all spiritualities, I pray to the divine. Thank you for the hearts, minds, and spirits that have come together this evening, the kindred spirits that care about creation and who are committed to being better stewards of the earth and of our siblings. Inspire us in this time, encourage us, restore us, and renew our hope for the work that we are doing. May this evening give us new hope, new ideas, and just inspiration and maybe new friends with which to move forward in our efforts to take care of this wonderful landscape and creation that you have given us. In my faith, I pray to Jesus, and to the divine, I say, amen.
Thank you, Reverend Veronica, for that invocation, getting us centered. I so appreciate that. And my name is Reverend Brian Souter, he, him pronouns, Executive Director of Faith and Place, tasked with spending a few minutes to somehow summarize to you all the exciting things that are happening at Faith and Place currently. So I only have a couple of minutes.
I don't hear you.
Typical. Oh, can you all hear me okay?
Don't hear
I
you.
can.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I'm a typical preacher. I like to go long, but I'm going to keep it short tonight, just to give you the update of Faith and Place. So as you may recall, in February of this year, we merged with Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light out of Indiana, Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light out of Wisconsin, to be working as Faith and Place, the proud Interfaith Power and Light affiliate of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana, working as 3 states, working courageously together as a network of people of diverse spiritualities and faith to take on the biggest challenge of our time, and that is the existential threat of climate change, knowing that we 3 states contribute 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and knowing that if we can make a difference in these 3 states through our efforts, we can make a difference nationally as well. We're very excited that we are staffed up. As a part of that partnership, we have hired a full-time outreach person in Wisconsin, full-time outreach person in Indiana, and then a full-time policy person in Indiana, full-time policy person in Wisconsin, to begin to grow and continue to expand the Green Team network across the 3 states, where Green Teams are getting involved with our energy and climate change program, water program, food and land use, youth programming, and our advocacy work, and then partnering with our policy teams to advance campaigns in our legislative systems at the municipal level, at the state level, at the federal level, to advance environmental and racial justice and to move millions, if not billions of dollars into communities that have been historically divested from. All us staff at Faith and Place, along with our board members, joined together a few weeks ago to do some strategic planning. And at that strategic planning session, we really dove in, what does success look like across 3 states? How do we serve our audience and our green teams better? How do we make sure that we are a healthy network of people of diverse faith and spiritualities partnering together to advance our visions of environmental racial justice? Very exciting meeting, and we're coming out of that here at year end, excited to plan, excited to work, and excited to continue to be a strong affiliate with the national movement of Interfaith Power and Light. So you might not be from Illinois, Wisconsin, or Indiana tonight on the call, but you more than likely have a local Interfaith Power and Light affiliate in your state that you can get involved with and join this network of people of faith and conscience working together to be courageous, to take on the big issues of our day, and together make a strong, powerful difference. So we're very excited about that, excited about continuing to serve our green teams. Now, I'm also executive director, so it means it's year end and we're fundraising to support this good work that we're doing. And I'm very excited to announce to you that in a show of unity and support, former staff members from Hoosier IPL, Wisconsin IPL, former board members from Hoosier IPL, Wisconsin IPL, as well as current staff members and current board members, all pulled some resources together and said, we will match dollar for dollar donations that come in for up to $10,000 for donations that are given here at this year end. So if you're interested in having impact with Faith in Place and supporting us, every dollar you give tonight will be doubled by that amazing show of support of people that have been involved in this work in these 3 states for a long, long time. And I'm very excited about that. I see my colleague Liz put in the chat the way to donate and to have the impact for that doubled. We appreciate your support. This is the year of Thanksgiving, the year of gratitude, and it's without your financial support, we can't do the good work that we're doing, like bringing you all together tonight. So that's my update with Faith in Place. Didn't do too bad on keeping the update to a decent amount of time. I now want to pivot by introducing our keynote speaker tonight. And I'm very excited about introducing this individual. Usually on our monthly calls, we have a keynote speaker where we let them speak for 10 minutes and then we break out into our regional breakout rooms and we collaborate and plan together. Tonight, we're so excited about our keynote speaker. We're like, we're going to take the whole hour to hear what she has to say and to get the live update from COP27. And so it's my great joy to introduce to you Elsa Barron. Now, let me say a word about Elsa before I hand the mic over to her. Elsa is dialing in live tonight from Egypt, where she's been involved in COP27 activities. So she's going to give us the update. But I also want you to know that Elsa holds a bachelor's of science in biology with a supplementary major in peace studies and a minor in sustainability, all from the University of Notre Dame. She's a Fulbright awarded scholar. She has served as a research assistant at the Wilson Center Environmental Change and Security Program, a climate leadership fellow with Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. She has spent time working for Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light, as well as time working for Faith in Place, organizing for climate justice, working with people of faith. Her work has been featured in like the Hulu show, Cowpen Approves This Message. She's been on Fox and Friends. She's been featured in the Rolling Stone. She is a force to be reckoned with. And in the time that we got to work with her at Faith in Place, the joke was someday we're all going to be working for Elsa because Elsa's amazing. And she would always be dialing in from doing some amazing organizing work from somewhere fantastic in the country. So would you please join me either in the chat or putting your hands up or giving the clap emoji and welcoming Elsa Barron as our keynote speaker this evening. Elsa, turning it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, and to everyone who made this possible as well. It's good to see familiar faces online. And as I was mentioning before, I hope you'll forgive like my wet hair and kind of the shower or the hotel lobby here. It's later in Egypt than it is in Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin and everywhere else. But I am just so happy to be here, and I was really excited throughout this day thinking about what I was going to share, and yeah, how much I was just really excited for this conversation and for the questions that I hope you all have as well. So with that, I'll just jump in with, first of all, we did a land acknowledgement. So I'm here in the Sinai Peninsula, which has a rich history and tradition for many faith communities. It is also the homeland of Bedouin communities here who still live in this area and who provide tours actually and guide people through the desert to this day. And so I've been very blessed to be engaging with those communities, as well as the vast, like 40,000 people from around the world who have suddenly arrived in the Sinai Peninsula and in Sharm el Sheikh, which is a traditionally a resort town. So it's a very interesting setting to be having this really serious conversation and then passing on the bus the Egyptian version of Las Vegas on the way. So there are some funny moments as well, adding to the seriousness. So hopefully this helps the audio be a little bit better as well. So I'll do a little talking, but I also wanted to give you all a glimpse of what COP is like. And so I'll share my screen really quick with a few photos just to kind of help place you. So the theme of this COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties, which is the state meeting of the United Nations, climate change organization that brings together nations from around the world to have negotiations. There's been various agreements that have come out of this process, but right now we're really in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that's really the theme of this COP27, the 27th one of these convenings. The theme is implementation. So the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. It required, or it actually didn't even have a requirement mechanism, but it asked countries and gave them 5 years to come up with nationally determined contributions, which are shortened to NDCs. And those are nation by nation commitments to greenhouse gas reductions. And then last year in Glasgow at COP26 was kind of the unveiling and the finalizing, at least to a degree, of these NDCs. So we had kind of a calculation of the emissions trajectory, which was brought down from kind of worst case scenarios in the IPCC, or the scientific reporting, scientific tracking and forecasting metrics, but still left us far above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which has been the target goal of this process. So last year at COP26 in Glasgow, it left us at an emissions and a temperature warming trajectory of around 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius, which is incredibly devastating for communities around the world, and particularly devastating, I think it's important to point out, for small island and developing states that are mostly submerged at that temperature rise. And so that's one of the challenges of this COP, is that, COP26 didn't bring us far enough in terms of commitment, but now we're already moving on to implementation. So how do we kind of balance that in terms of pushing for stronger commitments while also working on the processes that need to be in place to be able to actually then implement the commitments that already exist, and hopefully the stronger commitments we can get to. So it is, it's a challenging position to be in. So in terms of implementation, so this is kind of one of the major walkways of the conference venue late at night. And so on Saturday, there was a protest and an action through the Blue Zone. This would traditionally happen in the city itself that is hosting the COP, but Egypt has been pretty strict on regulating activism. And so this ended up happening in the conference venue itself. And you can see here a coalition from the Lutheran World Federation with a sign that says, creation not for sale, really advocating for the dignity of creation and the protection of creation, kind of outside of a market-based system, but more moving that into a dignity-based system. And one of the major issues that both the faith community and the activist community, and also small island and developing states, and the G77, which is a group of 77 countries, have been advocating for at this COP, focused on implementation, working on taking the nationally determined contributions from last year and turning those into action, is climate finance. And I've picked up a phrase from the policy world in DC, which is that planning without budget is hallucination, is kind of how it goes. And I think the same is true for this COP process and for global commitments to emissions reductions and to climate adaptation, is that finance is really important. And when we talk about finance at COP27, there are really three key categories that we talk about. One is mitigation, the next is adaptation, and the last is loss and damage. And so mitigation is finance to actually reduce emissions. And a lot of times that looks like investments in the energy transition and in renewable energy development. And so the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed in the United States is a really good example of strong mitigation finance that's going to help us reach our nationally determined contribution of greenhouse gas reduction. The second kind of climate financing is for adaptation. And there's a really important fund that kind of the highest emitting and most developed states have promised to provide, which would be $100 billion of climate finance for nations that have not contributed as much to emissions and are less equipped to respond to climate impacts, to take that funding and apply it to adaptation strategies to ensure that they are prepared to be as resilient as they possibly can through climate disasters as those kind of ramp up. Because, you know, even as we're in this fight to reduce emissions, we know that our world has already warmed and disasters are already happening. We saw that over and over again this summer. And so that adaptation finance is really important. And it has been more difficult to acquire than mitigation finance has been, especially because of that lack of ambition, I would say, from some of the most developed states to provide that finance. And then the last category, which has really emerged for the first time with an actual space for negotiation at COP27, is loss and damage. And that's an acknowledgement that, you know, climate impacts have already happened. They have caused loss. They have caused economic losses. They have caused losses to homes, to livelihoods. They have caused people to be displaced. You know, they have lost lives as well. And so acknowledging that loss and damage and providing a payment in return for loss and damage that countries around the world have experienced. And so that's a very kind of new space that the negotiations are moving into. And we're waiting to see kind of at this point whether that will turn into an actual finance mechanism out of this COP, a new finance mechanism, or if it will turn into a 1 or 2 year process to determine what that will look like. So we could come out with a mechanism, or we could come out with a process for hopefully, you know, creating that. So that's a lot, like 3 areas of finance with kind of different states and aims. So I'll take a step back kind of from the technical, and I'm happy to answer any questions or go into more detail on that. But I'll take a step back and put these 2 like just absolutely stunning photos up of Mount Sinai. And there's been a lot that's been happening on the negotiation side, but there's also been a lot that's been happening in terms of reflection and coalition building and community building here at COP. I think as a civil society representative, that's one of the most, you know, powerful components of this convening of tens of thousands of people. And so over the weekend, I had the opportunity to hike Mount Sinai through the night and kind of arrive at the top to see the sunrise. And as it turns out, there was actually an interfaith group that had intended to gather, a large group that had intended to gather on Mount Sinai However, they weren't able to get the permits from the Egyptian government to do so. So they transitioned and met in London, but a couple of faith representatives still hiked Mount Sinai, and we bumped into them, and we were able to actually join this ceremony to read a list of 10 principles that have been developed around climate change by the faith community as part of a declaration. And so the 10 principles were kind of mirroring the 10 commandments that were delivered at Mount Sinai in the faith tradition of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities. And so the 10 principles, so we just kind of joined the ceremony. My sister and I, we were invited to read some of these principles, and it was really beautiful. And I'll share those principles with you to kind of bring this into a faith perspective and a reflective perspective as we ponder the sunrise together as well. So the first principle is that we are stewards of this world. The second principle is that creation manifests divinity. The third principle was that everything in life is interconnected. The fourth principle is to do no harm. The fifth principle is to look after tomorrow. The sixth principle is to rise above ego for our world. The seventh principle is to change our inner climate. The eighth principle is to repent and return. The ninth principle is that every action matters. And then the last principle, the 10th one, is use your mind and come with an open heart. And so just reflecting on those principles, I don't know if they're, completely comprehensive of everything that the faith community brings to this challenge, but I think there's a lot of beautiful things in there. I think the challenge to kind of rise above ego, to question the roots of the climate crisis, kind of as a spiritual crisis, as one that requires technology to solve, but isn't, solely solved by technology. It's also solved by heart change and community change. And I think those principles kind of bring out those commitments as well. So what I'm really excited about here is to get to your questions and hopefully have a dialogue and a conversation on this. But before that, I couldn't help but put these pictures in because I had the honor of meeting with the US congressional delegation last Friday and speaking to them as a representative of Young Evangelicals for Climate on behalf of the faith community. And there were actually two other faith leaders in the room as well who are presenting their perspectives. And to meet with the congressional delegation and kind of push forward what we see as priorities at this COP, and then bringing this COP into climate action back in the United States. And then to hear as well from Congress, like what we need to do to move this momentum forward. And what was overwhelmingly the case, the three kind of outcomes from the civil society members in the room, who all had a chance to present their brief position, was that there's a lot of excitement about the Inflation Reduction Act and its passage in the United States. And that brings a really strong and important commitment to climate finance on the mitigation side for the United States. But then the second big outcome was that it's really, really important to ensure that that finance is investing in environmental justice and doing it well, and not further marginalizing any communities in the renewable energy transition itself. And then kind of the third major call from the civil society members in the room was that the United States really needs to commit to global climate finance. That's a really important part of our ambition. And it is not only a moral imperative, but it's also important for ensuring stability in the world as nations are experiencing more and more impacts that they don't necessarily have the capacity to address. And those impacts build upon each other. If you have multiple disasters and you haven't recovered from the first one, that can put a nation and a community in a really, really challenging position. And so in response, I'll stop sharing so I can kind of be more in dialogue here, but in response to those three items, the members of Congress really told us that they need more support from the public on global climate finance if that's going to be something that's possible to get through Congress. And so I'll just flag that Biden's current FY23 budget request currently has $11 billion included for global climate finance. And there's a lot of questions as to whether that will actually remain in the final budget that's passed by Congress. So that's something to keep in mind as part of the role of the United States in this conversation, and a way that we can be advocates not only for our own communities, but be members of a global society and stand in solidarity with communities around the world. I think it was really interesting that the news around Jackson, Mississippi, and the water crisis there, and the flooding there was coming out at the exact same time that the news in Pakistan about flooding over 1/3 of the landmass of the country was coming out. And just to juxtapose those two and see that the community in Jackson, Mississippi has a lot in common with communities in Pakistan. They're experiencing similar impacts and injustices. And for different reasons, those communities have been underprepared and under-equipped to be resilient to climate disaster. And those are issues that we should all care about. And so, sorry, I hope that the audio isn't too bad. And so I think that's really important for us to be thinking about. So I will kind of stop the presentation there, and I'm very open to questions about anything that's been happening at COP, any of the technical terms or negotiations that are ongoing, or also some of the faith language and calling and action steps that we might take. So I will turn it over to, I believe, Cindy to moderate the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Elsa. I really appreciate it. It's so interesting to hear an on the ground report from COP. We do have some questions that have come in the chat. I'd encourage other people to have questions, maybe put those in the chat as well. One from Mary Blackburn says, how are assurances made about the money that's committed for mitigation and adaptation and compensation? What kind of assurances are there that they go to honest brokers? Because we've seen waste by greedy people, and times when money doesn't reach the intended people who should benefit from it. Has there been talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, and a really thoughtful one. And a lot of times, so there are these funds that the UN has set up to distribute a lot of this climate finance. So there's the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. I think the Green Climate Fund, I believe, is kind of the bigger one and the one that more people are talking about moving forward. And that fund has a leadership structure that is co-shared by developed and developing nations. And then it determines how to actually then distribute that money. And there is a vetting process for ensuring that the money is going into the hands of trusted parties. But this is actually a really, really big challenge because a lot of times the communities that are most vulnerable and potentially most in need of particularly climate adaptation finance are also areas where there might be corruption or there's not a lot of trust in the government to be a party that can receive and distribute those funds well. And so it's a really big challenge because what often happens in that case is that those communities don't receive the finance at all and are kind of experiencing the double vulnerability of climate impacts and a corrupt government or a government that's not looking out for the best interest of the people. And so I don't have an easy answer to that question. I think what it shows is that the fund is vetting where this money does go, but that it's not a perfect system in terms of helping people who need it most, and that there are communities that fall through the cracks, and that we should be thinking about that and troubleshooting it and working to provide assistance in creative ways and ensure that communities aren't left behind. So that's a really, really important question.
Thank you. I'll note also that Karen has pointed us to a group called the Enhanced Transparency Framework of the UN that oversees these sorts of distributions and helps make sure that they get to the right places. So she suggests that we can look for more at Together for Transparency, and I just put that in the chat. So that's an interesting lead as well. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, you're welcome. They had a panel discussion today, and it's a kind of a new thing, you know, to avoid the problems that you were just talking about. They have a very specific framework, but they will help. See, this is the important part. They'll help governments and groups to apply and meet the criteria of this framework. And that's a really important part of what the UN does in a lot of these programs. So they have technical advisors and they have people that will help implement whatever is needed and needs to be in place and assured and all that other stuff for the funds to go through to realize programs that are supported by the community.
Thank you. Let's take some other questions. Here's one from Robert. Was there any discussion about potential deforestation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or a possible consortium of DRC, Brazil, and India seeking subsidies?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely conversation about deforestation. And I haven't heard anything. I haven't attended any events specific to the DRC. But last year at COP26, there was an agreement to end deforestation. That was a really, really big victory celebrated in Glasgow. But I do know, and I'm not remembering exactly which states signed on and didn't sign on, but it wasn't a universal declaration. And so I think that there's still a lot of really important conversations to have on this front, and bringing in particular, I mean, these nations, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Brazil, and India are all critical to protecting rainforests and forests. And that's an important part of an important source of carbon sink and also healthy ecosystems. So that is really, really important. And maybe I'll take that as a mission tomorrow to stop by. There are pavilions for different countries. So I can give it an effort to stop by the pavilion of the DRC and see if I can chat with someone about their work.
Thank you. There has what news? Whoops. Could people put themselves on mute if they're not talking? what news that we've gotten in mainstream media here has pointed out that there are a lot of oil lobbyists and fossil fuel lobbyists at COP. And I also want to ask about another issue that has come up in the questions a couple of times, and that's has there been a lot of talk from those people or others about carbon capture and storage as a possible solution, which we have various views of that, but it's certainly not a cheap solution or something that's available uniformly or equitably. What have you heard about that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about the fossil fuel lobby, and COP is a lot of things. And it's growing bigger and bigger every year. So it's a diplomatic negotiations process, but it's also a, organizing venue for activists. And it's also kind of a trade fair for people presenting new business ideas and technologies. And then it's also kind of an innovation summit. So it's a strange mix of things. And I think the conference is trying to work that out. And we're seeing every single year increasing, particularly the oil and gas lobby. The nuclear lobby is very strong, and that's a controversial topic. I think, well, from my perspective, thankfully, I don't think I've heard much at all about carbon capture and storage this year. I think that there are demonstrated solutions that are much cheaper and faster and less fraught than carbon capture and storage. And so I think that the conversation has somewhat moved beyond that. Carbon markets are still a big part of the conversation. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is what addresses carbon markets, which is why we say net zero and not zero. And it's so the fact that you can kind of offset carbon elsewhere through projects that reduce carbon in other parts of the world. And that's very controversial as well, because it often allows nations like the United States to continue emitting while other nations are kind of picking up that burden. There is a kind of a financial compensation for that. So it's very complex, and people have different opinions over whether that's an important way forward or if that's a false solution. So I think that's more so where the conversation is on carbon markets as opposed to carbon capture this year.
Thanks. Here's a question from Bob. Perhaps you saw an article from another activist, Bill McKibben, who says that we need to be upfront about the fact that we have missed 1.5, that our trajectory is way past 1.5, and that the urgency of dealing with what lies ahead of us would only be enhanced if we would admit that and make plans accordingly. Has that been part of the conversation?
Yeah, I didn't actually see the article from Bill McKibben, but I had dinner with him on Saturday, so I should have asked him about it then. I think that this is really, really concerning because we're not on trajectory for 1.5 degrees. And I think that's what I mentioned at the beginning, is that this is an implementation COP. We're supposed to be moving into taking the commitments we have and translating that into action. But the commitments that we have on the table right now put us far above 1.5 degrees. So that's a real tension. And I think the challenge with saying, we have to, I'm not exactly sure what his argument was in this case, but for example, for a small island in developing states, 1.5 degrees is really like a lifeline. It's the difference between having a nation and not having one at all. And so it's a really, really human target. I mean, we're talking about like tenths of a degree centigrade around the world, but that translates into lives and homes. And so I think it's really challenging to say 1.5 is not achievable given how much is at stake in this conversation. On the other hand, we are absolutely not on track for 1.5. And I think to have any hope of improving that trajectory, we need to talk about that. And I haven't actually heard as much about kind of the missed target this COP as I have about finance. So that's a point to keep in mind and to keep pressing forward on.
Thank you. That's troubling. And yet, when you talked to the congressional leaders and they have had this good news about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, how would they like to have support? How can we show support for what can happen through that act and to make sure that that act is implemented equitably and fully?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think just to note that the global climate finance components of the Inflation Reduction Act were cut from the bill. So that's kind of always, that's a story I'm hearing over and over again, is that it's already a real challenge to get financing for the energy transition in the United States, and then moving that one step further to supporting adaptation around the world is like even harder. And so I think one thing we've been thinking about is putting together a call script for people to call their representative about the upcoming budget request and the importance of that climate finance to remain in the budget request, just because it tends to be kind of not a much talked about issue domestically in the United States. It happens at these like negotiations, but it doesn't necessarily translate to what people are thinking about on the day to day. So that's a potential way to get involved. And, we're still kind of thinking about the organizing of that. But if we do, I'll definitely be sharing that with Faith in Place to hopefully get out the word that that's something we can take action on. In terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, I think that Faith in Place itself is involved in translating a lot of money that comes from the federal government to the communities that need it most. And so I think continuing in that commitment is part of the puzzle as well. And there's a lot of fantastic groups who are keeping up the advocacy and acting as that bridge between what is happening at a legislative level and what is happening at a community level.
Thanks. More and more questions here. Brian says, are we going to skip over just dinner with Bill McKibben? What was that like?
Well, get this, it was dinner with Bill McKibben and Katharine Hayhoe on a boat. And the rest of our program, which is called the Christian Climate Observers Program. And it was really, really fantastic, I think, to hear, particularly from Bill McKibben. I mean, I've followed his work and his writing, clearly not close enough because I missed this article that just came out. But I don't, so often hear him speak from a faith perspective. And so that was very encouraging. And kind of a different angle and kind of a hopeful angle to the conversation. And one thing that I really took away, so there was a woman on our program who came from Australia, and she had mobilized, I think an entire group, I think they were entirely women, who had signed up for this, to knit climate scarves. And so each line of the scarf it represents the temperature of that year from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the present day. And so, you know, this is a common illustration where it starts out in the blues and ends up in the harsh reds by the time we get to present day. And, you know, she was sharing and gifting these scarves to high level leaders. She got one to John Kerry's staff. She got one to some Congress people. She gave one to Bill McKibben and to Catherine Hayhoe as well. And I think two things really resonated from that display. One was that, you know, she was bringing her local community into this international space and having a real impact. I mean, people were very moved to think that someone sat for hours knitting this scarf and kind of praying into it or meditating on the crisis that we have, and then, you know, the solutions that we need to bring and the urgency that we need to bring. And then kind of the second point is she mentioned that one of the women who was knitting the scarves said, you have to get this out of my house. It's causing me too much grief. To have it here, to have knitted it, and to have, you know, spent so much time really thinking about the intensity of this issue. And I need to have it leave my home. And, you know, I think we need those moments of realization of the grief of this issue and the realness of this issue. And I think that was really important. So that doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with Bill McKibben, but that's immediately what I thought of, was just how much that story sat with me and how human this conversation is. It's diplomacy at work, but sometimes those turning points are an older lady in Australia knitting a scarf and sending it on its way.
That's a beautiful story, and reminds me of Catherine Hayhoe's call for us all to have more conversations, to just talk with our people about what we're facing and how important that is. We're getting towards the end of our time, and I wanted to let you know that there was a ask early on if you would be willing to share those 10 principles that were recited at the top of Mount Sinai. I think that people found that very meaningful and beautiful, and we'd love to have a copy of that if that's possible to share. Let's see. Everyone will be getting an email with the recording of this time together. And so let's have that recording include our sincere and grateful thanks to Elsa for being with us. Let's give her another virtual hand, a round of applause. We're so thrilled to have you active in this work and to share this work with you. So proud to know you and glad that you're there. Glad that you stayed up till the middle of the night. I'm telling you, it's close to 1 now or close to 2. And I know that you've got another big day ahead. Is this tomorrow the last day of the conference? Are you looking forward to anything particular happening there?
Oh, that's a really good point. So tomorrow is the last officially scheduled day of the conference, but we've heard strong rumors that it's going to go into overtime on Saturday and maybe even Sunday, finishing up some of the negotiations, I think particularly on loss and damage. So I'm not necessarily expecting any big announcements tomorrow, but hopefully by the end of the weekend, we'll know how things are shaping up.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That gives us, we'll be sending thoughts and prayers your way and the way of the conference then over the next few days, that the best possible result will happen. Thanks so much for being here. I want to thank all the people who are participating tonight. We really appreciate your time, your care, and all the ways that you are working to make your own communities more healthy and more just. We are so grateful to be partners with you in this work and look forward to the next time we connect. We will have another monthly call in December the 15th. We'll be sort of wrapping up the events of 2022 and looking forward to what people in faith can be doing in the next year to continue our action and to make it even more impactful. So we hope that you will join us for that call. And I think that it's time for us to quit. So please keep in touch. Thank you so much. Let's all just join us next month as we dig into the work that we have to do. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Elsa.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's so good to see you all. And I really appreciate all of the good questions. You've left me with a lot to think about as well.